I want to read you a few pieces because diversity has been in the news almost on a daily basis. So let me start with this. In his inaugural address in January 1963, Governor George Wallace of Alabama thundered, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." About tomorrow, he was right. That's what's so frightening. Today's racial segregation, by contrast, consists of ethnic groups walling themselves off within institutions. 46% of schools segregate student orientation programs, 43% segregate residential arrangements, and 72% segregate graduation ceremonies. Okay, so that's a little crazy. This past week, at the Democratic Socialists of America convention in Georgia, the weekend came to a screeching halt when one delegate formally complained of, quote, sensory overload, end quote, from, quote, guys, end quote, whispering in the room, promoting another comrade to grab the microphone to angrily demand an immediate end to the use of gendered language. This is not make-believe. Our school teachers and university professors have been doing their best to discredit and destroy liberal individualism, freedom, merit, the search for objective truth, Western civilization, American culture, and capitalism. It's an ambitious agenda, but through the magic of social justice, they've made very great progress. Our speaker today is Heather McDonald. Heather is well known throughout the media. She has written extensively. She is on the bestseller list of the, here it comes again, New York Times. She is very well respected, an absolute authority in her field. And if you remember last week, we had the three academics here who were talking about fraudulent or ideal laundering in academic journals, which is very serious because public policy is often made based on academic research and academic papers that are published in prestigious journals. And they showed us that through the phony, bogus papers that they submitted that played to the bias of each of these journals, a dozen of them were accepted. And that was frightening. But what else is going on in the academy is what Heather McDonald is going to talk to us about today. She's going to give us a talk. We'll then have a brief interview on stage. And then we will, of course, open the floor to questions. I want to ask you first to please turn your cell phones off, especially yours, which has this musical interlude that's just incredible. So please turn your cell phones off. In the back, Heather McDonald's new book, The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University, and not only the university, but undermine our culture. Approximately 6 months ago, at a luncheon here in Aspen, we were discussing the whole routine on college campuses of snowflakes needing places to feel comfortable, needing coloring books, crayons, and maybe some, what's that clay we play with? Play-Doh, some Play-Doh. And there were chuckles in the group of this during this luncheon And one of the gentlemen, who is a businessman from Wall Street, said, just wait until these snowflakes get out into the real world. Boy, are they in for a surprise. And I said to him, you are 100% wrong, because when they come out, as they are already starting, they are going to alter the business culture to where you can't have lunch with a member of the opposite sex who's part of your company without being frightened, both of you, that something will be said. So this is extended beyond the university campus. So please welcome an incredible speaker, Heather McDonald. Thank you.
Wow. I'm in the middle of political entrepreneurship of a very, very high level. I never thought coming to Aspen I would hear anybody besides myself uttering such heretical thoughts. So this is really an experience, and I am so honored to be at the JCC Ideas Festival. Dr. Altman seemed to suggest that such days are rather routine. I don't care if they're routine. This light, the colors, the greenery is just so amazing. So I'm very grateful for you tearing yourself away from this extraordinarily beautiful, elegant, civilized environment to hear me talk, and I look forward to conversing with you afterwards. My heart goes out to the victims and their families of this weekend's grotesque, terrifying violence. The political roadblocks to rational restrictions on military weapons and ammunition must be overcome. But far more than gun control is at stake. We are in the midst of a roiling, venomous contest for America's self-definition. The rhetoric and position-taking in the Trump era has become ever more extreme and toxic, to the point that at times like this weekend, it feels like we are on the brink of a civil war. Trump's impulsive, sometimes factually inaccurate outbursts bear some of the responsibility for this state of affairs, but the divisions and hatreds long precede Trump. I'm going to argue this afternoon that the most powerful source of these divisions is an academic culture that compulsively divides Americans on the basis of race, gender, and other favored identity traits. If you would have had any exposure to this political season, you may have already seen that culture at work. The mainstream media automatically labels politicians by their race and gender, as in the frequent observation, for example, that last Tuesday's Democratic debate had, quote, exclusively white candidates on stage, whiteness being apparently more important than the fact that some of those candidates want to legalize illegal entry into the U.S. and reorient the American economy towards a socialist model. Political audiences are also defined by race and gender, with Trump's audiences being inevitably characterized as white, and that's presumptively racist, whereas predominantly minority audiences, as in the She the People conference this April, are deemed non-problematic. Politicians label themselves by their race, gender, and sexual orientation, with these traits being deemed synonymous with a particular point of view, as in Congressman Ayanna Pressley, she of the squad, warning this July that in the Democratic Party, quote, we don't need black faces that don't want to be a black voice. We don't need queers that don't want to be a queer voice. You may have also noticed some asymmetries. Here are claims that are not deemed racially divisive by the mainstream media. The criminal justice system is racist from front to back. Elizabeth Warren. The essence of America is to destroy the black body. Ta-Nehisi Coates, the darling of the college speaking circuit. Half of Trump voters are irredeemable racists, sexists, homophobes, xenophobes, and Islamophobes who belong in a basket of deplorables. Hillary Clinton. Police shoot blacks solely based on the color of their skin. Beto O'Rourke. White privilege is what protects your son from not getting shot by the police. Kristen Gillibrand. The Betsy Ross flag is a symbol of white supremacy. Colin Kaepernick. And Nike. A mural of George Washington is also a symbol of white supremacy, the San Francisco Board of Education. These positions are not divisive per the media. They're simply the truth. Here, whereas it is a vicious act of bigotry, according to our thought leaders, to criticize politicians representing a city, that would be Baltimore, where children and the elderly are routinely shot on street corners. Likewise, calling out 4 congressmen for their unrelentingly hostile portrayal of the U.S. as mired in, quote, bigotry, sexism, and xenophobia, in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's words, can have nothing to do with the substance of their positions, but is simply motivated by race. Objecting to football players kneeling during the national anthem allegedly has nothing to do with the issue of respect due to national symbols. Such criticism, justified or not, is simply a racist dog whistle. In a word, identity politics and anti-racism have become the religion of key American institutions, whether in the corporate world or the media, even as cases of actual bias exercised by organizations with power over people's lives are becoming ever more elusive. You therefore have to get creative. As you may recall, a tsunami of hatred crashed down upon a group of schoolboys from Covington, Kentucky this January because a doctored video showed one of the students, a smile frozen on his face, looking a Native American activist in the eye as the activist banged on a drum and chanted inches away from the hapless student. The media and the Democratic political class let out a glad cry. Here, at last, was ocular proof of American racism. Mirabile dictu, the boy was even wearing a MAGA hat. I don't know if I see any here today, but I hope not. The boy was, quote, the smiling face of whiteness, declared a University of Pennsylvania education professor. Whiteness, she added, that, quote, harms and maims and kills. New York Times, I said it too, I'm still here, columnist Charles Blow declared that the MAGA hat was the new iconography of white supremacy. And after someone got around to actually viewing the full video, which demolished the entire narrative about white male aggression towards people of color, the liberal establishment remained unchastened, ready for the next phony incident to supply it with still desperately needed corroboration for its favorite trope of patriarchal white supremacy. That next fabrication was quick in coming. The actor Jussie Smollett correctly bet that the political and media elites would deliriously welcome an absurd tale about his victimization by MAGA supporters, of course, at 2 a.m. in sub-freezing Chicago, because when it comes to white-perpetrated hate crimes, the demand for such examples is bottomless, but the supply is woefully thin. Naturally, when Chicago District Attorney Kim Foxx dropped all charges against Smollett for his costly hoax, and then came under criticism for doing so, racial activists claimed that she was being criticized only because she was black. Now, what is behind this frenzied drive to find spectral racism? A corrupt academic culture that has leapt out of the ivory tower and is fast remaking the world in its image. That culture is dedicated to 3 propositions that I've called the diversity delusion. First, that the most important thing about any individual is his race and sex. Second, that discrimination based on those characteristics is the core feature of the United States in particular and Western culture in general. And third, that any lack of proportional representation of females or so-called people of color in any American institution is by definition the result of discrimination. Business and nonprofit leaders would rather accuse their own organizations of bigotry than acknowledge the academic skills gaps, behavioral and cultural differences, and different career preferences that account for racial and gender disparities in the workplace and elsewhere. The diversity delusion is engulfing every aspect of American life, The Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings imported campus rape ideology into the Senate Judiciary Committee, in the process almost destroying the central achievement of the Western jurisprudential tradition, the presumption of innocence. The Black Lives Matter movement is a street version of the academic idea that America's criminal justice system is lethally racist and that the overrepresentation of blacks in prison must be the result of bigotry rather than blacks' exponentially higher rates of criminal offending. In New York City, the school's chancellor and mayor are demolishing the last vestiges of academic standards in the school system in the name of fighting the racism that is the only allowable explanation for the academic skills gap. So let's take a brief tour of where these corrosive ideas begin: American universities. In a word, colleges are in the grips of a mass hysteria. Students actually believe that they are at risk of their lives from circumambient racism and sexism. The degree of modern caterwauling is impossible to overstate. At Brown, students of color met with the president and demanded exemption from such ordinary academic expectations as going to class and studying for exams because, they said, they were so focused on, quote, staying alive at Brown. At Yale, a mob of minority students surrounded a respected sociologist and screamed at him for 2 hours because his wife had suggested that students can choose their own Halloween costumes, free from the ministrations of Yale's discrimination watchdogs. Among the shouts of "shut the F up" and "you are disgusting" that were directed at this mild-mannered left-wing professor was a cry of "we're dying," referring to the allegedly endangered status of Yale's minority students. This delusional mindset is getting angrier and angrier. This spring at Williams College, black students asked the student council for money for a blacks-only event. The council did not immediately rubber stamp the proposal due to various administrative complications. One of the petitioners exploded. Now, do you want the expurgated or the non-expurgated version? Non? Okay, this is not a family audience. All right, here we go. It's time for you all to figure this shit out and check yourself because I'm really losing it. We're fucking tired of having to come and beg and suck dick. Every time to be here is like sucking white dick every fucking day. Closing our mouths every fucking day just to be here. And if we dare ask for a little bit of time, money and space, we got to suck some more dick. It is so frustrating. It is so tiring to be here, to deal with y'all. This rage, it's not an aberration. It is ubiquitous and almost inevitably rewarded. Well, perhaps you are thinking, well, at least the adults on campus are trying to give students a firmer grip on reality. Wrong. A massive diversity bureaucracy is devoted to cultivating in students ever more arcane species of self-involvement and ever more preposterous forms of self-pity. Students regularly act out little psychodramas of oppression before an appreciative audience of diversity deanlets and vice provosts of equity, diversity, and inclusion who use the occasion to expand their domain. If you want to know why tuition is so obscenely expensive, look no further than these multiplying diversity sinecures. Many campuses have created bias response teams, modeled presumably on active shooter response teams on the assumption that discrimination is so rampant and lethal on campus that a rapid defense force is needed. Freshman orientations and dorm sessions feature seminars in toxic masculinity and white privilege. Students are taught that they are either the oppressed or the oppressors. If you are not female, Black, Hispanic, gay, or any of the 116 and still metastasizing categories of gender, the only way you can escape being an oppressor is by becoming a, quote, ally. Allies are something usually associated with war. And indeed, the reigning thinking is that female students and students of color are in a war zone on college campuses and need allies from the opposing side to survive. Am I exaggerating? I am not. UC Berkeley's Division of Equity and Inclusion, hung banners throughout campus reminding students of the university's paramount mission, assigning guilt and innocence in the ruthlessly competitive totem pole of victimhood. One banner featured a female black student and a male Hispanic student allegedly pleading, "Allow people other than yourself to exist," a message directed to Berkeley's white students and faculty. The diversity bureaucracy aspires to total control. You can't even answer the call of nature without being harangued. University of Minnesota diversicrats posted flyers in all dormitory bathrooms reminding students about their white privilege. College presidents are among the worst enablers of academic victimology. After the expletive-filled tirade directed against the Yale sociologist, Yale's president, Peter Salovey, actually thanked the student thugs for making him proud of his student body. Yale subsequently conferred a racial justice prize on two of the most aggressive participants. The dean of the Harvard Medical School recently removed the portraits of its greatest physician scientists from the entrance hall to one of its teaching hospitals. And I hope the ones you didn't invite don't suffer from this identical flaw. The reason for the Harvard defenestration was they were all male. And thus looking on them would make Harvard's wilting medical students feel unsafe and uncomfortable. We can only wish these budding doctors luck in the operating room. The faculty are equally complicitous. A math professor at Vanderbilt University argues that mathematics is a, quote, white and heteronormatively masculinized space. Hobart and Williams College offers a course in white mythologies, which posits that objectivity and meritocracy are smokescreens for slavery and the subjugation of women. A teaching assistant at the University of Georgia announced confidently that, quote, some white people may have to die for black communities to be made whole in this struggle to advance freedom. Shortly before the student tantrum at the Williams Student Council, several self-identified black, queer, feminist professors walked off the job to protest Williams', quote, anti-blackness and violent practices. May I observe in passing that there is no more tolerant spot on earth for queer, black feminists than Williams and every other American college? Identity politics has destroyed the serious pursuit of knowledge throughout the humanities and most of the social sciences. Students are being given a license for ignorance. All they need to know about a book is the melanin content and gonads of its author to know whether they can dismiss it as thoroughly repugnant and not worth reading. Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer, Plato, Kant, Locke, and Mill have been variously defenestrated by students who have not the slightest clue about Periclean Athens, the Renaissance, or the Enlightenment. A Columbia undergraduate groused about Columbia's beleaguered core curriculum, quote, who is this Mozart, this Haydn, these superior white men? The course, she said, quote, upholds the premises of white supremacy and racism. Few professors have ever defended our intellectual patrimony against such shameful outbreaks of ecstatic know-nothingism without adding some puling qualification about respect for diversity. And now every non-academic institution, no matter how previously meritocratic, is also in the crosshairs, and that means above all the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. Exhibit A in our culture's descent into identity-driven mediocrity is the firing of computer engineer James Damore from Google in August 2017. Damore had written a carefully reasoned, fact-based memo suggesting that the average career preferences of males and females may explain why there is not perfect 50-50 gender parity at Google and other big tech firms. The language that Google's CEO used in firing Mr. Damore was a direct import from academic victimology. Google's employees were, quote, hurting, he said, because Damore had dared to challenge the reigning orthodoxy. What followed Mr. Damore's firing was scarier still. A regional branch of the National Labor Relations Board upheld Google's actions on the same grounds. Mr. Damore's memo had made Google's employees feel, quote, unsafe at work, according to the NLRB Associate General Counsel. It thus constituted, quote, discrimination and sexual harassment. Consider for a moment what the NLRB ruling means for science. Any evolutionary biologist, psychologist, or economist who studies the different risk preferences and appetite for competition among males and females is vulnerable. Those branches of science could shut down completely no matter that their findings are true. And this morning at breakfast in the lovely Aspen Meadows, I happened to see Lawrence Summers, who you may recall was fired from Harvard for daring an even riskier hypothesis, which is that the average distribution of high-end and low-end math skills at the very bottom of the distribution skill of math cluelessness, males predominate. They're the dummies, but they're also predominating at the high end by ratio about 2 to 1. That was not acceptable at Harvard, and he was sacked. The mad rage for gender and racial proportionality in the workplace is accelerating, especially in the Me Too era. From here on out, everything you read, everything you watch in the mainstream media, if you still subject yourself to that experience, which I unfortunately am forced to by my profession, will have been calculated in conformity with the demands of diversity. Newsrooms are under enormous pressure to find reporters, select sources, and originate stories that improve their diversity profile. Book publishers are obsessively scrutinizing their lists for diverse authors and themes. Thanks to media pressure and their own human resources departments, corporate boardrooms have made a fetish of gender proportionality. As a result, whenever I get a proxy ballot and there's females on it, I vote against. I don't care about who they are. They may be the most fantastic investment bankers in the world. I'm sorry, they've got a mark against them because for all I know, they're there because of a gender quota. If you are a white male in any field, no matter how talented, you're going to have to meet a higher standard to get hired or promoted. If you have a white male son and he is neither gay nor trans, woe unto him. California Polytechnic University has proudly announced that it was successfully reducing the number of white students whom it enrolled. Other colleges are not as forthright about their intentions, but they are all involved in the same enterprise. A respected Midwestern evangelical college has virtually stopped admitting white males into its graduate programs because it knows they will have such a hard time getting a teaching job, and the college doesn't want to hurt its placement statistics. At Microsoft, managers get bonuses if they don't hire and promote white men. Has anyone heard of Manels? Okay, well, listen up. This is another signpost of the future. Manels are now verboten in woke society. They are a panel of experts consisting predominantly or exclusively of men. They're verboten, no matter if the male panelists at an Alzheimer's conference, say, represent the most cutting-edge scientists in the field. Last year, a professor at the University of California, Davis, demanded that every male scheduled for an upcoming conference on microbes resign and that the conference sponsors withdraw their support since the invited presenters were heavily male. The lineup changed immediately to a near majority of females. The University of California, San Diego congratulated itself earlier this year for inviting only females to a biology conference. Fanels, you see, are not just okay, they are glorious. Were the UC San Diego fanalists the best researchers in the field? Who cares? Even classical music is being poisoned by identity politics. New Yorker music critic Alex Ross triggered outrage against the Chicago and Philadelphia Symphony Orchestras last year by tweeting that they had programmed no female composer in their upcoming season. Never mind that at that very moment, the Chicago Symphony was at Carnegie Hall performing Jennifer Higdon's Concerto for the Low Brass, a work commissioned by the Chicago and Philadelphia orchestras, undoubtedly at greatly inflated cost. It is absurd to expect gender parity in the concert hall. The reality is this: the greatest composers of all time, whether Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Chopin, or Brahms, were all male. Get over it. And just be grateful for the beauty that they gave us unworthy mortals. But classical music boards are also under enormous pressure to hire by gender and race for conducting positions and everything else. A classical music agent told me wistfully, "If only I had a trans conductor, I'd be rich." Believe me, it's coming. Now, it is an unalloyed pleasure that Hollywood is being forced to sacrifice its best box office judgment to meet the demands of the race and gender bean counters. But it is in the sciences where the diversity imperative becomes most momentous. Every academic science department, whether physics, mathematics, or chemistry, is at risk. The federal government, and this is continuing, I'm sad to say, under Trump, is demanding that scientific departments hire based on gender, race, and sexual orientation rather than scientific merit. University administrators are ordering faculty search committees to tear up their short lists for hiring and reconfigure those lists to include more females regardless of qualifications. Science education is being slowed down and watered down in the hope of graduating more females and underrepresented minorities. An oncologist at an Ivy League medical school was berated by his dean for giving an exam in pharmacology that was too, quote, fact-based. I don't know about you, but if I've got cancer, I want my doctor to know the facts about drug interactions. The National Science Foundation is doling out millions of your taxpayer dollars to study alleged microaggressions and heteronormativity in engineering and math, arguing that discrimination against so-called diverse scientists is pervasive and that only so-called diverse labs can achieve scientific breakthroughs. Funny, somehow the 200 National Science Foundation grantees who won Nobel Prizes managed to discover dark matter and the genetics of viruses, among other accomplishments, without conforming to today's diversity metrics. And of course, this mania for gender and race parity in science continues into the private sector. After James Damore was fired, a human resources manager sued YouTube and Google for firing him because he had refused to go along with the mandate to interview only females, blacks, and Hispanics for entry-level engineering jobs. Potentially groundbreaking scientists are being passed over today because they are of the wrong race and gender. Guess who does not care about diversity metrics? China. The best thing that Donald Trump could do to level the playing field would be to airlift a few cargo planes of gender theorists from American universities and dump them on Beijing University and its research labs. Until that happens, though, China is going to inexorably pull out ahead because, at least in science, it seems to care only about one thing: scientific accomplishment. Identity politics is tearing our society apart. It is teaching young people to hate the greatest thinkers and creators of the past, and to hate their fellow Americans. And a backlash is brewing among the lost, fatherless young men who are being told relentlessly that they are the source of the world's evils. The diversity delusion, therefore, has to be explicitly challenged. The next time self-engrossed students occupy a campus building demanding more reparations, here is what their college president should say. Are you kidding me? You are the most privileged individuals in human history. You have at your fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for: knowledge. You are surrounded by libraries that would have driven the Renaissance humanists mad with envy and desire. You can read every book that has ever been written. You have access to scientific laboratories that are the most advanced in the world. You can pursue languages, literature, and history. Everything is available. Far from discriminating against minorities and females in hiring, every faculty search here is one desperate effort at finding remotely qualified underrepresented minorities and females who have not already been scooped up by better endowed schools. Far from discriminating against underrepresented minorities in admissions, we employ double standards in order to engineer so-called diversity. I can assure you that my faculty are not bigots. They have nothing but goodwill for history's oppressed groups and want all of their students to succeed. At this very moment, millions of Asian students abroad are studying night and day for the privilege of experiencing this alleged maelstrom of hatred. If you feel so oppressed, step aside and let them take your place. But a college president never says any of these things, of course. Instead, he is silent before these outbreaks of mania, happy to sell out his faculty as alleged racists, and promising to make further amends for so mistreating the oppressed students. It becomes imperative then for the rest of us to rebut the victimology narrative. It is not enough to call for freedom of expression. That is, if I may borrow a term, a relatively safe stance to take. Even some liberals will back you up. No, if we're going to restore sanity and civil harmony, we're going to have to take on the victimology narrative directly and assert that for all our historical flaws, and they were real and egregious, there has never been a more tolerant, opportunity-filled polity than our present one. The constant delegitimation of American institutions undermines the normative basis of law and order. The U.S. has been immune from the tribal anarchy that is still common in other parts of the world, but that may be coming to an end. A new path will remain reclaiming the university, since the preservation of freedom requires knowledge of how unique has been the West's development of the rule of law, the scientific method, and the concept of individual rights. But a university's highest calling is to convey the full glory of the Western inheritance, to inspire students to get down on their knees in gratitude rather than raising their fists in protest, to help them grasp the beauty, wit, and profundity of a vast and rich tradition, one to be discovered, if you will permit me, a selective and idiosyncratic list in the works of Aeschylus, Rabelais, Tiepolo, Twain, and yes, at the risk of student complaint, Mozart. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. With this headpiece, I've got a little sense of what it's like to be a superstar.
You are.
You don't have one. Oh, thank you. Just here.
Wow. Told you so.
I don't know what he told you.
First question. In the 60s, the students, many of us among them, demanded to be heard, demanded free speech, demanded that I can say anything I want to say. Now, they're demanding that I don't want to hear what this person has to say. I don't want to hear something that may offend me. What happened?
Well, you know, I think I'm not going to glorify the 60s because the rot, the seeds of the rot was already there. So I wasn't at the free speech protests at Berkeley, and maybe they should be taken at face value. Nevertheless, one of the more influential thinkers of the campus left in the 60s was Herbert Marcuse from the Frankfurt School, who had the concept of repressive tolerance. And it adumbrated what we're seeing today, which he said, in order to be tolerant of some points of view, we have to be intolerant towards others. We have to be repressive towards those views that make it hard for the victims to speak out. So that idea was already latent. And what you had, what I will say, I will come up with my own golden age, however, which was in the 70s, like your possibly free speech 60s. Again, I'm not qualified to make that judgment. But in the 70s, I was in college, and I feel extraordinarily privileged that I was allowed to read Chaucer, Milton, Wordsworth, Spencer, and Wallace Stevens without anybody thinking to complain that they were all male. The 70s, multiculturalism and feminism had not hit the academic culture yet. We had the riots, the 60s and 70s. You had the black takeovers of Cornell, Claremont McKenna, and the roots of black radical politics. But it was still latent. The 80s is when the multiculturalism hit. The victim ideology became very predominant, and the idea that certain types of speech with which you disagree puts you at lethal risk of your life started to take root then. But it's been going on. People have been ignoring what's been going on college campuses for decades, thinking, as you say, the halcyon view that let these snowflakes merely get out into the real world and they'll, get a backbone and the employer will, slap them around. And that was the thesis of a very persuasive at the time book by Michael Barone, a very great Washington columnist who talked about hard America and soft America, the universities being soft America that, teach people to think of themselves as victims. And he said, let the graduates of soft America get into hard America, and as you said, they'll fess up. Unfortunately, he was wrong about that.
You've spoken about gender, you've spoken about racist, all of the victimology. There's something else going on very strongly on college campuses, and that is the sexual abuse, rape culture. Laura Kipnis, in her book, Unwanted Advances, posited as a liberal, progressive feminist writing this book, told the story of what is going on many college campuses, at least up until a year or two ago, whereby consensual sex could occur and either partner within 60 days later could retroactively withdraw consent. I ain't making this up. It is serious stuff, because at that time, when that consent was retroactively withdrawn, the assumption would be that the male was accused, and of course it could be any sex, but the male was accused and could not have representation and could not face his accuser and could not question his accuser. Would you comment on that?
Well, yes. Let me make a slight modification to your wonderful introduction, just to make sure that there's no misunderstanding out there. You said what's going on campuses is the rape culture. I know what you meant to say is what's going on campuses is the conceit of the rape culture, because I don't want anybody to walk out of this room thinking that the rape culture on campuses is real and that there is an epidemic of campus rape, which is what you would believe if you followed the media exclusively. Let's just observe some facts about our current reality. Every year, the stampede of females to get into college grows more and more overwhelming. Highly educated mothers, themselves the products of the left-wing campus, are starting their little darling daughters out at $250 an hour prep for pre-K in the hope of making sure that they get into Harvard 16 years later. Now, if these statistics that we've been hearing that, again, predated the Obama administration, but the Obama administration made it far worse, that 1 in 4, 1 in 5 college co-eds will be the victim of terrifying sexual assault during her college career. There would have been a stampede out, a stampede to create safe environments where females will not be raped, create more female-only schools, and to demand that the colleges change their admissions criteria, which are allegedly admitting in hordes of rapists. Instead, what goes on every weekend? You still get the sorority girls trooping off to the frat parties because the students understand, by and large, that what's going on there is something more complicated than this simple feminist morality play of rape. It is a drunken hookup culture in which the females drink themselves blotto precisely in order to lower their sexual inhibitions and engage in these drunken one-night hookup stands. The next day, frequently come to regret it, whether because they've been two-timing their semi-boyfriend or simply the feminist bureaucracy got its talons into them, and as you say, retroactively then call rape. I think what's going on actually is sexual liberation is having a nervous breakdown on college campuses. It turns out that the premises of sexual liberation got it wrong. The premises of sexual liberation are that men and women are identical in their libidos. Both men and women, according to sexual liberation, desire no strings attached, sex with as many partners as you can have, with as little subsequent expectations, as little prior relationship, and that everybody will think this is a great situation. It turns out that that is not the case. Males and females on average, and I'm not making, I know there's exceptions, have different physical responses to sex. As a gynecologist, you understand the hormonal component of this. And females have a harder time walking away from those drunken hookups without feeling any pang of emotional connection. And they are now re-importing Victorian values into the campus to make males the sole exclusive guardians of female well-being. So if both parties are equally drunk, it becomes only the male responsibility to look out for the well-being of the female. It's not symmetrical. Females are simultaneously insisting on the prerogative of maximal promiscuity and at the same time the prerogative of being wilting violets who, after a consensual drunken hookup, decide that they've been just destroyed for the rest of their lives. So it's a completely bizarre environment, and as you say, the due process problems that are coming out with these kangaroo courts that are stripping males of the fundamental cornerstones of the search for truth, which is cross-examination, the ability to face-to-face accuse your witness. They are abominations. The Trump administration is pressuring colleges to introduce a few little shreds of due process back in, but still, it's still a very ideologically charged and incredibly hypocritical environment.
And this Laura Kipnis, who wrote the book, wrote it because she was so upset about the loss of feminist values, meaning It was making women look like little waifs who couldn't take care of themselves and couldn't say no and couldn't properly not drink themselves into oblivion, right. And that this was so anti-feminist to her.
Right. I mean, I'm not against Victorian values. Don't let anybody get me wrong. I think that probably the Victorians had a better understanding of human nature, developed over millennia, than we do now. I think we're going through a period of denying the obvious, and obviously the trans phenomenon, which is very deep and very puzzling, and is perhaps a touchstone of what's going on now. And I'm not sure I've yet to understand it fully, but I have some thoughts. But I'm not against, frankly, an understanding of chivalry, of female modesty and prudence when it comes to sexual relations. I think that is a preferable world to live in than perhaps what Laura Kipnis would have, because she's at least on the right side when it comes to due process and fairness. I'm not sure that some of them, like Camille Paglia, who again is somebody I respect enormously, I'm not going to say that the ideal situation is pretending that males and females are identical with a good component of due process injected into that.
Last question from me before the audience. Talk about the SATs and the new adversity score.
Well, colleges are getting nervous that their previously almost unchallenged reign of being able to use very large racial preferences in admissions. So there is not a selective college anywhere today that is not admitting so-called underrepresented minorities with about a standard deviation difference of academic qualifications. There's been a 200-point gap on the SATs for decades now that has not closed at all. And so colleges are engaged in an extraordinarily cruel and destructive practice in order to engineer their quota of diverse faces. They are putting these underrepresented minority students under a handicap that no other student group is forced to bear, which is to be catapulted into an academic environment for which they are not competitively qualified. Let's take it out of race for a moment. And let's say that MIT decides it needs more females in its undergraduate body and admits me to its freshman class, and let's say that on an 800 score scale of math SATs, I have a 650, which is an okay score. You know, it's respectable, but it's not great. But my peers who have been admitted without regard to gonads are probably all clustered around 800. So what's going to happen to me in my first year with my 650? I am going to struggle in freshman calculus. I am going to fall behind. I'm probably going to switch majors. Maybe I'll decide to become a gender studies major, which unfortunately does exist at MIT. And I have two alternatives. I can say, I have been admitted to an environment for which I was not academically qualified. Or I could say, I am the victim of the patriarchy and rape culture, and that's why I am struggling and why I feel out of place on this campus. We'll change the scenario just in one way to, instead of gender, race, and the identical thing is going on. Now, if with my 650, instead of going to MIT, I was admitted to Boston College or Boston University, perfectly respectable institutions, I would do fine, and I would probably graduate with a STEM major. Likewise, if the black students, who today are being admitted to, say, Duke University, with a standard deviation of scores below, and who are dropping out of STEM at a huge rate and going into soft fields, if instead they had been admitted to North Carolina University, they would graduate in a STEM field, So racial preferences are cruel and destructive, but the colleges are getting nervous that maybe their reign of being able to engage in this cruel practice may be coming to an end, and so they are trying to work out alternatives to using race. And so the SAT, which you would think the SAT would be defending itself, because as you may recall, the SAT was developed to be an objective score to overcome class bias and religious bias, to get rid of the ceiling on Jews, to break the lock of the elite prep schools on Yale and Harvard, and say, no, we are going to look at objective merit. And we're just going to take out who you are and do this on the basis of objectivity, a test that is anonymous, no human intervenes, it's just a multiple choice. Instead, the SAT should be proud of that. Instead, it has been captured by the left, and it too is saying, oh, the SAT objective, it may be biased. Believe me, they have spent decades trying to comb through and find any bias remaining in the SATs. It ain't left. There's nothing left in it. It is a fair test. But the College Board, which administers this, sees the writing on the wall, and so it's now developing an adversity score for students, which is a surrogate for race that says if you come from single-parent homes or in a neighborhood where there's high degrees of crime, we're going to adversity norm your score. So it's like race norming, but it's adversity norming. And so you're going to get the boosts that now race provides. Let me give you an example of how it works for race. At Harvard, again, this is how preposterous it is, this idea that this is a systemically racist country. If you have a son or daughter, do you want him or her to be black or white applying to Harvard? If any of you guys don't know, I envy you, your trust in our institutions. Thanks to the ongoing discrimination lawsuit against Harvard, into which, Harvard had to be dragged kicking and screaming into court to divulge some of the data on its admissions practices, being black alone boosts your chances of admissions 4 times over any other candidate. High-income blacks with scores way below low-income Asians are being admitted. A score that would give a low-income Asian a 25% chance of admissions to Harvard would be a 95% admissions guarantee with the identical academic profile if that student was black.
And this suit was brought by the Asians.
By the Asians, who are the ones that are being screwed the most. And we're supposed to believe it's white privilege that characterizes our schools today. Well, the Asians in New York City who are being harassed for predominating in our selective exam schools, they're neither white nor they're privileged, but they're whooping everybody's ass because they have a culture that is fanatical about academic achievement, and that is the solution to our ongoing academic skills gaps.
We're going to open the floor to questions. Could you raise your hand if you have a question? We hope that you will stay for this, but just in case some of you have to go on to the next activity, we thank you very much for your presence, and most of all, we thank this incredible speaker.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
And please make sure It's a question.
That was very interesting. You almost lost me early on when you said Brett Kavanaugh and the presumption of innocence, because my response internally was, what about the credibility of a erudite woman like Christine Blasey Ford? I'm not talking about Me Too. I'm talking about a very specific presumption of innocence and presumption of credibility. How do you deal with that?
Well, the mantra for the hearings was believe survivors. That is a direct import from academic culture, is that anybody who comes forward with an accusation of a sexual assault is entitled to automatic belief. Again, this was the hashtag that went around during the Kavanaugh hearings, believe survivors. And to question a self-described survivor's account, and let's also note, of course, that the very term survivors, which is now de rigueur in the media, if anybody brings forward an accusation, that female is by definition a survivor. It's a very maudlin term, I would argue, is entitled to automatic presumption. And to put that person through questioning is to not be sensitive to that person's traumatized status. And there's an entire ideology being worked out now within parts of the psychiatric and medical profession saying to justify any so-called survivor whose stories don't hold up, who has memory gaps, as we had with Christine Blasey Ford, that we should not expect survivors to be able to present coherent tales because the trauma is so great that their memory, we shouldn't expect their memory to be trustworthy. So they win either way. If their story is coherent, they win. If their story is incoherent, that's all the greater proof that they were raped. So I would not object if the idea was, let us put both the accuser and the accused before a neutral tribunal and allow both of them to cross-examine each other, but that is not the dominant ideology that prevails on college campuses, where males are not allowed to cross-examine their accuser. There is no greater truth-telling mechanism that has ever been evolved than cross-examination, and that is being routinely denied the accused on college campuses.
Well, I have a number of questions, but I guess what I would like to hear from you personally is, if it's not too painful for you, to tell us about what happened to you at Claremont College.
Well, I'm certainly not going to invoke pain because I can't stand that rhetoric. Very simply, I had been invited by a government institute there to talk about my previous book, The War on Cops, which argues that the Black Lives Matters narrative that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of black males is just outright false and dangerous. And I use data, federal data, looking at shooting rates, at crime rates, and say that it's just not true. The problem that we're facing is an epidemic of crime, not of police shootings. Crime predicts police shootings. There is no evidence that white officers shoot blacks at higher rates than other officers, or that blacks are being shot at higher rates than their crime rates would predict. This is not, being able to argue from the facts is not allowed on college campuses. So I was told the day before that the protests were planned. They were thinking of moving my venue away out of an auditorium that had too many plate glass windows because they were worried about the possible risk of violence there. They kept it there, but what happened was that the students, about 250, 300 students of the local Claremont McKenna, as well as the other very liberal schools in that area, Pomona, Harvey Mudd, Scripps, surrounded the auditorium so that nobody was allowed to enter. these students had decided that me, this racist, fascist, homophobe, queerphobe, and ignorant of interlocking systems of domination, which is how I was referred to, could not be allowed to speak. And so I spoke to an empty auditorium, and the students outside were pounding at the windows and chanting and drumming. And at some point, the police decided they couldn't guarantee my safety any longer, so they shut it down, and I was escorted through the kitchen by police officers and taken away. But so it is something, to actually experience the power of the mob. You can read about it, but to actually be face to face with that degree of irrationality and that degree of self-righteous confidence that they have the right to censor other people, that any competing narrative is simply not allowed. It is really stunning. And again, as Dr. Altman said, they are coming, they are here already. They are at Google. They are at Microsoft. They are exercising their censorious power over what can be said in American discourse. And, we are unique among countries in protecting even what is called hate speech. And it's hilarious, the expansive, elastic quality of the word hatred these days. I mean, hatred is basically any idea that you do not agree with. And a racist is a conservative who's winning an argument against a liberal. So anything, the idea that, like, what I speak about is hate is ridiculous. But so we still have the constitutional protection, and our federal judiciary has been pretty good about protecting speech. But that may not last. If the Yale law students and the Harvard law students who descended on Washington during the Senate Judiciary Committees with their Believe Survivors signs, when they graduate, those Harvard law students and Yale law students have a very large chance of ending up on the federal judiciary. If they carry their Believe Survivors ideology with them to the federal bench and believe that female self-described rape victims are automatically entitled to belief, you can kiss due process goodbye. So the federal judiciary is no longer safe because the law schools are pumping out this victimology at an equal rate to the undergraduate colleges.
I'm very optimistic.
I know I should give you hope. But
This is basically what you're talking about is fascism in a different form, just like climate change is fascism, but a lot of people don't get that either. So is there enough pushback going on? Are there young men who want to get into a good school, putting on wigs and makeup?
yes, they should, right.
Are they doing it?
Well, I hope so. I mean, yes, every student should check off the race box.
Does blackface work?
Stop.
It's interesting. The left can't figure it out. I mean, on the one hand, race is a social construct, and yet, if you say, I don't see your race, I believe in seeing your character and your individuality, that's racist. So do not ignore somebody's race, even though it's a social construct. It's very complex. I can't figure it out. But what I really hope is that every male athlete declares himself trans. After all of this effort of the gender feminists to use Title IX to get rid of the male athletic programs, to bring in the money for the females, and now, you've got the male track stars that are setting track records that will never be beaten by an authentic female. And the feminists are like saying, well, how do I deal with this? Like, am I feminist and think this is like, 10 years ago, imagine this, if 10 years ago a male showed up and said, I'm going to compete against females in track or swimming, the feminists would have said, that's just like a male to muscle in on our territory and destroy our ability to succeed. The identity politics has moved so fast that the feminists are unable to complain about these males muscling in on female territory. It's very, very curious. So yes, we got to game the system and play their cards. But the main thing is, please, you guys, do not send another dollar to your alma maters. Starve the beast. Shut it down.
You know, we spoke earlier today about the situation, the difficulty feminists are having with what is being done to women under Islam.
Right.
And the fact that they're kind of caught between, well, you know, we have to stand up for women, but gee, that's another culture. And could you just talk to that briefly?
Yeah, well, I referred to this ruthlessly competitive totem pole of victimhood, and one never knows like who's going to be the top dog victim. Right now, it's trans. They just everybody is below them, kowtowing, but it won't last. And you know, we should all have a sweepstakes here of who gets to choose, who successfully picks the next top dog victim. And I don't have the expansive imagination to be able to predict it, but it will come. Somebody's going to bump trans off the top, and there'll be somebody else. And God knows what it'll be. It's sort of scary to think about, but it'll come. But we have these clarifying moments when you see, okay, what is the current pecking order of dominance? And one of those moments was January 1, 2014, when a wave of sexual assaults broke out across European cities. They were concentrated in Germany, but it was in Sweden, it was in France, it was in Italy. When you had rampaging mobs of Muslim immigrants going through the streets, attacking females who were out celebrating New Year's. The females were groped. Some of them were grabbed and penetrated. Now, we keep hearing in the West about rape culture. And I keep looking around and say, where's the rape culture? You know, as a female in the United States, I have more freedom, more opportunity than any female in human history, and frankly, I do not regard female as being an accomplishment. I do not regard it as particularly interesting. But if I want to find rape culture, I would look at what happened on New Year's. That is the patriarchy, that is rape culture. So what happened? Here we have a conflict between the demands of feminism and the demands of multiculturalism, which say that the only allowable source when you're talking about oppression, racism, and bigotry, the only place you can talk about is the West. Every other culture, every third world culture, they are places of freedom, openness, love, and peace. So you cannot criticize Islamic culture. And indeed, that is what happened. Following these mass sexual assaults, following an instantiation of rape culture, the feminist lips were sealed. Because to complain about the fact that it was Muslim men, not these nice, well-heeled, well-behaved Germans that were assaulting women would violate the fact that for now, at that moment, the multicultural agenda was on top. If any of you husbands were to suggest that your wife don a burqa, you would be tarred and feathered. But it's perfectly fine for a Muslim husband to suggest that clitorectomies are fine when practiced in Muslim cultures. The double standards are truly stunning. But it comes from this growing, deep-seated hatred that the West is turning on itself. And I don't know how much longer a civilization can survive with this much self-loathing. And again, we didn't get into it today, but I would argue that these shootings that we're seeing is a closing of the circle, that you have these troubled, fatherless young men, white, who are being told incessantly by the mainstream culture that they are worthless, and they are making the perfectly logical step. If every other group gets its identity politics, why not them? And a few of them are going to act out, and I am not justifying this violence. It is horrific, it is criminal, and I wish we had a fast death penalty rather than 20 years of appeals, because people who engage in these mass shootings should be immediately punished. Nevertheless, there is a logic, a tit for tat that is going on, and as I say, we may be heading towards civil war. I fear it.
So I've never been a organized religion kind of person, but the more I look at where society's trending, and these ideas seem almost like satanic. They take away the individual. You focus on the rate, and the shootings that are happening and stuff. And I don't know that I can see a solution unless we, reground ourselves in religion or find a new one or something like that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm a big Enlightenment person. I really revere the Enlightenment tradition of reason and tolerance. So I certainly understand the argument for religion, but I think that until the Enlightenment came along, I think tolerance is a secular value, that religion gave us its own share of warfare and oppression, and obviously many positive benefits. Again, classical music is the most important thing in my life. My life would be far the poorer without Bach's St. Matthew Passion, the B minor Mass, and the Baroque tradition in architecture and art that was so closely aligned with the Catholic Church. But I would argue that a proper respect for the power of reason against tribal identity should be enough. Now, that may be naive, but I am not willing to give up a secular ideal.
Let's take one more question. First of all, this gentleman had mentioned that there was some hope, at least, with the University of Chicago, where the president sent out that letter to the admitted pre-freshmen before they got there, basically saying, don't bother coming if you're going to pull this stuff here. That's
Right.
just summarizing the whole
Yes,
thing.
right.
Any comment on that?
Yes, it's Robert Zimmer and his provost. They did send out a very clarifying welcome message saying, again, we do not have safe spaces here. I don't want to always be negative because I know one wants hope, but I'm just going to give you I'm going to complicate the picture a little bit. Again, We are in a race against time. We're in a race against demographic time. The more the young people go, the more faculty comes out of the victimology narrative. There's no taking it back. A professor at the business school at Chicago invited Steve Bannon to debate globalism, trade, and immigration. Now, hundreds of faculty at the University of Chicago, so lauded for this stance taken by Robert Zimmer, signed a petition saying disinvite him. He should not even step foot on campus because he would put our communities of color around Chicago at risk. What? Like Bannon and debating Louis Zingales on trade is going to put people on Chicago's south side at risk. If only that was their biggest risk. You know, believe you me, as somebody who spent a lot of time reporting from the west side and south side of Chicago, I can tell you Steve Bannon ain't the problem there. But these faculty have so little trust in the power of debate. I would think if I loathe Steve Bannon, what would I like to do? I'd like to have him on the debate stage and grill the guy. But they have so little faith in the power of reason and discourse, they just want to silence him. So Chicago, you know, it's a give and take. You've got a few leaders, but the faculty are still out there teaching students the victimology. So it's in a race against time. All of us, here's the key. Here's the key. The way we fight this thing, as long as the diversity delusion, that narrative that says the only allowable explanation for ongoing socioeconomic and racial disparities is racism, they win. I can tell you that's what's driving everything here. They win. If anybody has a mouthpiece, we have to start saying no. There are other causes, and those are behavioral and cultural. And people need to step up to the plate and have the courage to say, no, there are large cultural differences that need to change if we're going to bring poverty down and narrow the economic gaps.
When a politician or public speaker makes an obviously mistaken statement about crime in the United States, and the statistics are so obvious,
right?
Why don't the Times, the Washington Post, and other respected newspapers challenge that?
Well, that is easy. The New York Times and the Washington Post are themselves some of the most important mouthpieces of leftist ideology. That ideology, again, that says you may not talk about behavior. The only allowable explanation is systemic racism. The real perplexity to me is why don't police chiefs give the facts? Here are the facts. We hear about mass incarceration. The prison population in the U.S. is about a third, a little over a third black. The population of the black population in the U.S. is about 13%. So there is an overrepresentation there. The only allowable explanation is the criminal justice system is racist. Here are the facts. Blacks commit homicide at 11 times the rate of whites. They die of homicide at 8 times the rate of whites. That death rate is the civil rights problem we should all be worried about. It is not just that blacks face that much higher rate of dying by homicide. But you know who's killing them? Not the police and not whites, but other blacks. A police officer in this country is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black man than a black man is to be killed by a cop. An unarmed black man is to be killed by a cop. Blacks have made up 42%, black males have made up 42% of all cop killers over the last decade. even though black males make up only 6% of the population. In New York City, black and Hispanic shootings are about 100% of all drive-by shootings. Even though whites are 34% of the population, they commit less than about 1.5% of all shootings. Nope, the police chiefs are so cowed by this mainstream media narrative that they would rather, it's like the college president who's willing to sell out his faculty as bigots. The police chiefs will not get up there and say, let me tell you the facts. Based on victim and witness IDs, overwhelmingly minorities themselves, of who's doing the shootings, who's doing the robberies, who's doing the aggravated assaults in my city. He would rather be silent and let the New York Times and the Washington Post say that the only allowable explanation for the fact that, yes, blacks in New York City are frisked at higher rates than their population would predict. And the reason is because the people who they are shooting in drive-by shootings, when they cooperate with the police and give victim identifications and witness identifications, and those victims and witnesses are overwhelmingly black themselves, tell the police that it is blacks who are committing the shootings. And the police chiefs would rather let their officers twist in the wind of phony charges of racism than get the facts into the public discourse. It is extraordinarily bizarre. But that is the terror that is laid upon virtually every mainstream institution in our country, including the members of the criminal justice system, to talk about the behavioral gaps that are responsible for disparities, whether it's in prison or in poverty rates. The biggest thing I would talk about is out-of-wedlock child rearing. That is the biggest divide. 73% of black children born to single mothers. That is a civilizational catastrophe. And unless that changes, the other behavioral gaps are not going to close either.
I get one last question, I'm told. I just want to push back on your response to the gentleman here about religion. Clearly, reason and the Enlightenment was very important, but it was Judeo-Christianity that injected ethical tenets into a cruel and warring world. And I think it was Chesterton that said that when you stop believing in God, it's not that you believe in nothing, it's that you believe in anything. So today, don't we have that problem? That people, especially young people, are not believing in nothing, they're believing in anything, like the virtue of socialism, like white supremacy, like all the things that you've been talking, the diversity delusion. And so to some extent, wouldn't it be better if we had more of these intermediary organizations? The Bowling Alone book by Robert Putnam a decade or more ago talked about we need more Boy Scouts, not less. We need more bowling leagues, we need more church. We need more. You're sitting in a Jewish community center with Hebrew right behind me. Don't you think that would be one of the ways to address this?
Well, I love the Boy Scouts. I've been in inner city scout troops. It is a thing of beauty to see little boys in Bensonhurst, in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, in central Harlem, in a church basement, learning how to tie knots and pledge allegiance to the flag. And unfortunately, the Boy Scouts have been nearly given a death blow by the gay activists because of their previous, now lifted stance on openly gay scoutmasters. And it's just incredibly, all the corporations that had used to give them support withdrew their funding because of their gay employees saying, our pride is more important than giving that poor black kid in central Brooklyn his only hope at bourgeois values. So these civil institutions that you speak about, I completely agree, they are extraordinarily important. I would point out that socialism was also a product of the Judeo-Christian civilization. Some of its most articulate exponents were Jewish. I would also point out, possibly, I would say that there's been a lot of religious division, and we're now in a wonderful state where we talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition. That wasn't always the case. That wasn't always the case. There was an extraordinary amount of animosity between Jews and Christians. And I would say, again, it was thanks to the values of the Enlightenment that have taught religion to mind its manners a little bit. And I also am not going to claim, I know that there was barbarism in other cultures that are not Judeo-Christian. I am not, however, going to assert that the only place where you can find values of hospitality, of kindness, is within the Judeo-Christian tradition. I think that there are norms that have been positive in other traditions as well, which isn't to say that I'm not also going to say that the West had some magic sauce that became especially beautiful and stunning with the early seeds of Enlightenment culture with our scientific revolution. It's just been unbelievable. So, but I understand your question.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Heather.